In the mountains of Afghanistan, where silence means survival and one wrong move means death, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos held her breath. Through her scope, she could see the nightmare unfolding below. 12 of her fellow Rangers were trapped in a valley, completely surrounded by 50 enemy fighters who had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The ambush was perfect. The enemy had the high ground, superior numbers, and all the time in the world. But they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten about the ghost watching from 1,200 meters away. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. A single sniper, armed with nothing but her rifle, her training, and an unbreakable will to save her brothers in arms, was about to turn an impossible situation into a legend. This is the true story of how one woman's incredible marksmanship and split-second decisions saved 12 lives and changed the course of an entire mission. The clock was ticking. Her teammates were running out of ammunition. The enemy was closing in. And Maria Santos was about to prove why she was called the best long-range shooter in her unit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop, her sniper rifle steady against the bipod as she scanned the valley below through her scope. The air was thin at this altitude, and every breath required effort, but Maria had learned to control her breathing long ago. She was the overwatch for Operation Silent Thunder, a mission that was supposed to be routine reconnaissance. 12 Rangers moved through the valley in a tactical formation, their movements precise and calculated. Team leader Sergeant First Class David Chun led the patrol, with his men spread out in a diamond formation that maximized their field of view while minimizing their exposure. They were investigating reports of enemy movement in the area, gathering intelligence on suspected weapons caches that had been smuggled through these mountain passes for months. Maria had been positioned on her overwatch point since before dawn. Her role was simple but critical: provide long-range support and early warning for any threats the ground team might miss. At 1,200 meters from their position, she could cover nearly the entire valley floor with her M24 sniper rifle. The weapon was an extension of her body after years of training and combat experience. She knew exactly how the wind would affect her shots, how to compensate for the altitude, and how to make impossible shots look routine. The patrol had been moving for 2 hours when Maria first noticed something was wrong. Through her scope, she caught a glint of metal from a ridge on the opposite side of the valley. Her training kicked in immediately. She adjusted her scope and focused on the area where she had seen the reflection. What she found made her blood run cold. Hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation were enemy fighters, at least 15 that she could count from her position. They were positioned in a semicircle around the valley floor, with more fighters moving into position on the high ground. The ambush had been carefully planned, with the enemy fighters using the natural terrain to remain hidden while they surrounded the Ranger patrol. Maria immediately reached for her radio to warn the ground team, but as she did, she spotted more movement. Additional enemy fighters were emerging from concealed positions, and the scope of the threat became clear. This was not a random encounter or a small group of insurgents. This was a coordinated ambush involving at least 50 enemy fighters, all armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly. The valley floor provided little cover for the Rangers, while the surrounding ridges gave the attackers multiple firing positions and escape routes. The Rangers were walking directly into a kill zone that had been prepared specifically for them. Someone had fed the enemy information about their patrol route, and now 12 of America's finest soldiers were about to be slaughtered. Maria's finger moved to her radio as she prepared to call in the warning, but she was already too late. The first shots rang out across the valley, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. The Rangers immediately dropped to whatever cover they could find, but the rocky valley floor offered little protection from the crossfire that erupted from multiple directions. Sergeant Chin's voice crackled over the radio, calm despite the chaos erupting around him. His team was pinned down, taking fire from 3 different directions, and their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, making it nearly impossible for the Rangers to move without exposing themselves to deadly crossfire. Through her scope, Maria watched as her teammates fought for their lives. She could see muzzle flashes from dozens of enemy positions, and the volume of fire being directed at the Rangers was overwhelming. Bullets were striking the rocks around them, sending deadly fragments flying in all directions. The Rangers were returning fire, but they were outnumbered more than 4-1, and their ammunition would not last long. Maria began her mental calculations automatically. Wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, altitude, and distance all factored into every shot she would take. At 1,200 meters, even the slightest miscalculation could mean the difference between hitting her target and missing completely. The .308 Winchester round she fired would take nearly 2 seconds to reach its target, and in combat, 2 seconds was an eternity. The radio crackled with updates from the ground team. They had sustained casualties, with at least 2 Rangers wounded and unable to move effectively. Their position was becoming more precarious by the minute as the enemy fighters adjusted their positions to tighten the noose around the trapped patrol. The Rangers needed support, and they needed it immediately, but the nearest backup was over an hour away. Maria realized that she was the only thing standing between her teammates and complete annihilation. The enemy fighters had not spotted her position yet, giving her the element of surprise, but that advantage would not last long. Once she started firing, the enemy would begin searching for her position, and at 1,200 meters, she would be vulnerable to return fire from their larger weapons. She selected her first target carefully, an enemy fighter who appeared to be directing the others from a position on the eastern ridge. He was armed with what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, and if he managed to get a clear shot at the Rangers below, the results would be catastrophic. Maria adjusted her scope for the exact range and began to control her breathing, waiting for the perfect moment between heartbeats to take her shot. The crosshairs settled on her target, and Maria squeezed the trigger with the same smooth, controlled pressure she had practiced thousands of times. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately cycled the bolt to chamber a fresh round while tracking her target through the scope. The bullet struck the enemy fighter's center mass, dropping him instantly and sending his weapon tumbling down the rocky slope. But Maria's work had just begun. 49 enemy fighters remained, and they were all focused on destroying the Rangers trapped in the valley below. She had perhaps minutes before they realized they were being engaged from long range, and she intended to make every second count. The lives of 12 Rangers depended on her ability to thin the enemy numbers before they could overrun her teammates' position. She selected her next target, another fighter who was attempting to flank the Rangers from the south. This shot was more challenging, as the target was partially concealed behind a boulder, but Maria had made more difficult shots under worse conditions. She adjusted for the slight wind that had picked up and squeezed off her second round, watching as another enemy fighter fell. The battle in the valley continued to rage, with the Rangers fighting desperately to hold their position while Maria worked methodically to eliminate the threats surrounding them. Each shot required complete focus and precision, and there was no room for error. The lives of her fellow soldiers hung in the balance, and Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was about to prove why she was considered one of the finest marksmen in the United States Army. The radio crackled with another update from Sergeant Chin. The enemy was preparing for a final assault, and the Rangers were running critically low on ammunition. Time was running out, and Maria knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her teammates lived or died in this remote valley in Afghanistan. Maria's third shot rang out across the mountain valley, and another enemy fighter crumpled to the ground. The sound of her rifle was beginning to echo off the surrounding peaks, and she knew it would not be long before the enemy realized they were being engaged from an unexpected direction. Through her scope, she could see some of the fighters beginning to look around nervously, searching for the source of the precise shots that were systematically eliminating their comrades. The Rangers in the valley were still pinned down, but Maria could hear the relief in Sergeant Chin's voice as he reported the pressure was beginning to ease slightly. The enemy fighters were becoming more cautious, taking better cover instead of exposing themselves to direct fire at the trapped patrol. This bought the Rangers precious time, but Maria knew she needed to act more aggressively to truly turn the tide of the battle. She shifted her position slightly, moving to a different firing angle that would give her a better view of the western ridge, where a large concentration of enemy fighters had positioned themselves. The movement was risky, as it exposed her to potential counterfire, but staying in one position too long would make her an easy target once the enemy located her. Through her scope, Maria could see a group of 5 enemy fighters who were preparing to advance down the slope toward the Rangers' position. They were armed with automatic weapons and grenades, and if they reached the valley floor, they would be able to attack the Rangers from close range where their superior numbers would be decisive. Maria knew she had to stop this advance before it could gain momentum. The first target was approximately 1,150 meters away, moving quickly between rocks as he descended the slope. Maria tracked his movement, leading her target slightly to account for his speed and the bullet's flight time. She squeezed the trigger and watched through her scope as the enemy fighter stumbled and fell, rolling several meters down the rocky incline before coming to rest behind a large boulder. The other 4 fighters in the group immediately took cover, but Maria had already selected her next target. One of them was attempting to use a small outcropping for protection, but his position left his torso exposed to her angle of fire. The shot was challenging because of the partial concealment, but Maria had trained for exactly these types of scenarios. She adjusted her aim point slightly and fired her 5th round. The bullet struck the target in the upper chest, and he collapsed instantly. The remaining 3 fighters were now completely pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to Maria's deadly accurate fire. This effectively eliminated their planned assault on the Rangers' flank. But Maria's actions had not gone unnoticed. She could see enemy fighters on multiple ridges beginning to scan in her direction, and muzzle flashes started appearing from positions that were trying to suppress her overwatch position. Bullets began striking the rocks around her, sending chips of stone flying through the air. The enemy had finally realized that a sniper was engaging them from long range, and they were beginning to coordinate their response. Maria rolled to a new position behind a different rock formation, carrying her rifle and ammunition with practiced efficiency. The new position gave her cover from most of the return fire, while still maintaining visual contact with the valley where the Rangers were trapped. She could hear bullets ricocheting off the rocks where she had been positioned just seconds earlier. From her new firing position, Maria could see that the enemy was beginning to reposition their forces. Some fighters were attempting to move to positions where they could engage her directly, while others were maintaining pressure on the Rangers to prevent them from breaking out of the kill zone. The enemy commander was clearly experienced, adjusting his tactics to deal with the unexpected threat from long range while not allowing his primary targets to escape. Through the radio, Maria could hear Sergeant Chin coordinating his team's defense. 2 of his Rangers were wounded but still fighting, and their ammunition situation was becoming critical. The team was down to their last few magazines, and without resupply, they would be overrun within minutes. The nearest friendly forces were still over 40 minutes away, far too long for the Rangers to hold out against such overwhelming odds. Maria realized she needed to be more aggressive in her targeting. Instead of picking off individual fighters, she needed to focus on eliminating the enemy's leadership and heavy weapons operators. Through her scope, she searched for targets that would have the greatest impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault. She spotted what appeared to be a command group positioned on the northern ridge. 3 figures were clustered around what looked like a radio operator, and one of them was pointing toward the valley while apparently issuing orders. Taking out this group would disrupt the enemy's coordination and potentially cause confusion in their ranks. The range to the command group was approximately 1,240 meters, near the maximum effective range of her rifle under these conditions. Maria would need to account for the increased bullet drop and wind drift at this distance, and there would be no room for error. She studied the wind indicators carefully, noting the movement of dust and debris kicked up by the ongoing firefight. Maria selected the figure who appeared to be the leader based on his position and the way the others were oriented toward him. She made her calculations and adjusted her scope accordingly. The shot would require perfect timing and execution, as the target was partially concealed and moving occasionally as he directed his forces. She controlled her breathing and waited for the optimal moment. When the target moved into a clear firing lane, Maria squeezed the trigger smoothly. The bullet traveled for what seemed like an eternity before striking the enemy commander in the center of his chest. He dropped immediately, and the other two figures scattered for cover. The impact on enemy coordination was immediate and dramatic. Maria could see through her scope that the disciplined assault was beginning to break down as individual groups of fighters lost contact with their command structure. Some units continued their assault, while others began to hesitate, unsure of their orders or objectives. But the enemy was far from defeated. Even without their original commander, they still outnumbered the Rangers by more than 4-1, and many of the fighters were experienced veterans who could operate independently. Maria could see several groups beginning to coordinate their own local assaults, and the pressure on the Rangers remained intense. She continued her methodical elimination of targets, prioritizing those who posed the greatest immediate threat to the trapped patrol. A machine gunner who had been providing suppressive fire was her next target, followed by a fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher who was maneuvering for a shot at the Ranger's position. Each shot required complete focus and precision. At these ranges, even the slightest error in calculation or execution could result in a miss, and Maria could not afford to waste ammunition on poor shots. Every round needed to count, as her supply was limited and there was no possibility of resupply until the battle was over. The enemy return fire was becoming more accurate as they began to triangulate her position. Bullets were striking closer to her cover, and she could hear the distinct crack of high-velocity rounds passing overhead. Maria knew she would need to relocate again soon, but moving during daylight across the rocky terrain would expose her to enemy observation and fire. Through her scope, she watched as a group of enemy fighters attempted to use the distraction of their return fire to advance on the Rangers' position. They were moving in short rushes between cover points, using standard infantry tactics to close the distance while minimizing their exposure. Maria tracked their movement and selected targets as they exposed themselves during their advances. Her next shot dropped the lead fighter just as he was preparing to sprint to a new position. The second fighter in the group immediately went to ground, but his position left him exposed to Maria's angle of fire. She chambered a fresh round and eliminated him with her next shot. The remaining fighters in the group were now effectively pinned down, unable to continue their advance without certain death. But time was running out. Maria could see through her scope that several other groups of enemy fighters were continuing to close on the Rangers' position from multiple directions. Despite her success in eliminating key threats and disrupting the enemy's coordination, the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. The Rangers were still vastly outnumbered, and their defensive position was becoming increasingly precarious. The radio crackled with another update from Sergeant Chen. His team was down to their last magazine per man, and the wounded Rangers were becoming less effective as their conditions deteriorated. The enemy was preparing for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault from multiple directions, and without immediate intervention, the Rangers would be overrun within minutes. Maria realized that her long-range shooting, while effective, was not going to be enough to save her teammates. She needed to find a way to even the odds more dramatically, or 12 of America's finest soldiers were going to die in this remote valley. The weight of their lives rested on her shoulders, and Staff Sergeant Maria Santos prepared to take the most desperate action of her military career. Maria's mind raced as she analyzed the tactical situation unfolding below. Through her scope, she could count at least 35 enemy fighters still active and positioned around the valley. Despite her success in eliminating key targets, the enemy retained overwhelming numerical superiority, and they were beginning to coordinate for what appeared to be a final assault on the Rangers' position. The trapped Rangers were clustered behind a small cluster of boulders in the center of the valley floor, their defensive perimeter shrinking as ammunition ran low and the wounded became less effective. Maria could see Sergeant Chun moving between his men, redistributing ammunition and adjusting their defensive positions to maximize their remaining firepower. But even from 1,200 meters away, she could tell that their situation was becoming hopeless. Through her radio, Maria heard Chen's voice, still calm despite the desperate circumstances. Two of his rangers were now seriously wounded and unable to fight effectively. Private Martinez had taken shrapnel from a grenade explosion and was barely conscious, while Specialist Johnson had been hit in the shoulder and was having difficulty handling his weapon. The remaining 10 Rangers were down to less than 2 magazines each, barely enough ammunition for a few more minutes of sustained combat. Maria realized that conventional long-range shooting would not be sufficient to save her teammates. She needed to create a more dramatic shift in the tactical balance, something that would either break the enemy's will to fight or reduce their numbers significantly enough to give the Rangers a fighting chance. As she studied the enemy positions through her scope, an idea began to form in her mind. She had noticed that many of the enemy fighters were positioned near large boulders and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover from direct fire. But these same positions had a critical vulnerability that Maria could exploit. Many of the rocks showed signs of weathering and fracturing, with visible cracks and loose sections that appeared unstable. If she could target these weak points with precision shots, she might be able to create rock slides and collapses that would eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. The concept was extremely risky and had never been attempted under combat conditions, but Maria's extensive training in precision marksmanship had included courses on ballistics and target analysis that covered exactly these types of scenarios. She knew that a high-velocity rifle round could create enough impact force to destabilize already weakened rock formations, especially if the shot was placed precisely at the optimal stress point. Maria selected her first target carefully, a large boulder that was providing cover for at least 4 enemy fighters. The rock showed clear signs of stress fracturing, with a visible crack running down one side that appeared to be the result of years of freeze-thaw cycles. If she could place a shot at the exact point where the crack met the base of the boulder, the impact might be enough to cause a collapse. The shot would require extraordinary precision, as the target area was less than 6 inches wide and partially obscured by shadows. At 1,200 meters, even the slightest miscalculation would result in a complete miss. Maria studied the target through her scope, calculating wind drift and bullet drop for what was essentially an engineering shot rather than a traditional combat engagement. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger with the same smooth pressure she had used for hundreds of previous shots. The bullet struck the crack in the boulder exactly where she had aimed, and, for a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a deep rumbling sound that echoed across the valley, the entire rock formation shifted and collapsed, sending tons of stone tumbling down the slope. The 4 enemy fighters who had been using the boulder for cover were caught completely off guard. 2 were crushed instantly by falling rocks, while the other 2 were trapped beneath smaller debris, their weapons lost in the rock slide. The psychological impact on nearby enemy fighters was immediate and dramatic, as they realized that their supposedly safe positions were not as secure as they had believed. Maria quickly selected her next target, another unstable rock formation that was sheltering a machine gun team. This position was approximately 1,180 meters away and presented an even more challenging shot, as the stress point she needed to hit was partially concealed behind vegetation. She studied the target carefully, identifying the optimal impact point that would cause maximum structural failure. The second engineered collapse was even more spectacular than the first. The entire hillside seemed to shift as thousands of pounds of rock and debris cascaded down the slope, completely eliminating the machine gun position and creating a cloud of dust that temporarily obscured visibility in that section of the battlefield. 3 more enemy fighters were eliminated instantly, and several others were forced to abandon their positions to avoid being caught in the slide. The psychological effect on the remaining enemy fighters was profound. Maria could see through her scope that many of them were beginning to question the safety of their positions, and some were actually abandoning good cover to move to areas where they felt less vulnerable to these devastating precision strikes. This movement exposed them to fire from the Rangers below, and Chen's team was able to eliminate several more targets with well-placed shots. But Maria's unconventional tactics had also drawn increased attention to her position. Enemy fighters were now actively searching for her location, and several were attempting to coordinate indirect fire on suspected sniper positions. She could see groups of fighters moving to positions where they could engage her overwatch point with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded approximately 50 meters from Maria's position, sending rocks and debris flying through the air and filling her immediate area with smoke and dust. The concussion from the explosion was powerful enough to make her ears ring, but her position behind the large rock formation provided adequate protection from the shrapnel. She knew that the enemy had not yet pinpointed her exact location, but were getting closer with each shot. Maria quickly relocated to a third firing position, moving with the speed and efficiency that had been drilled into her during years of training. The new position provided better concealment while still offering clear fields of fire toward the valley. As she settled into her new spot, she could see that her tactics were beginning to have the desired effect on the enemy's morale and coordination. Through her scope, Maria observed that the enemy fighters were becoming more cautious and less aggressive in their assault. Many were spending more time looking for stable cover rather than focusing on their attack on the Rangers. This hesitation gave Chen's team the breathing space they desperately needed to reorganize their defense and make their remaining ammunition more effective. But time was still working against the Rangers. Despite the psychological impact of Maria's precision strikes, more than 25 enemy fighters remained active, and they were beginning to adapt to the threat she represented. Several groups were coordinating their movements to advance on the Rangers' position, while others attempted to suppress her overwatch point with sustained fire. Maria realized she needed to identify and eliminate the enemy's remaining leadership before they could regain control of the situation. Through her scope, she searched for fighters who appeared to be coordinating the assault or directing other fighters. Leadership targets were often difficult to identify in the chaos of combat, but Maria had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated command authority. She spotted a fighter positioned on the eastern ridge who appeared to be using hand signals to coordinate the movement of two separate groups. This individual was approximately 1,220 meters away and was using excellent fieldcraft to remain partially concealed while still maintaining visual contact with his subordinates. Taking him out would require another precision shot under challenging conditions. Maria studied the target's pattern of movement, noting that he exposed himself for brief periods when signaling to his fighters. She would have only a few seconds of opportunity when he next emerged from cover, and the shot would need to be perfect. She prepared her rifle and waited for the optimal moment, controlling her breathing and heart rate to ensure maximum stability. When the target briefly exposed himself to signal another group, Maria was ready. Her shot struck him center mass, and he dropped immediately. The effect on the two groups he had been coordinating was immediate, as they lost their tactical direction and began to operate independently rather than as part of a coordinated assault. The radio crackled with an update from Sergeant Chen. The pressure on his team was beginning to ease slightly, and they had managed to eliminate several more enemy fighters who had been forced to expose themselves during their repositioning. The Rangers were still vastly outnumbered and critically short of ammunition, but for the first time since the ambush began, they had hoped that they might survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Maria knew that she had disrupted the enemy's assault and bought precious time for her teammates, but the battle was far from over. More than 20 enemy fighters remained active, and they were beginning to adapt their tactics to deal with her long-range threat. The next phase of the engagement would test every skill she had learned during her years of training and combat experience. As she prepared for the continuing battle, Maria's radio crackled with a new transmission that would change everything. Reinforcements were finally en route, but they were still 30 minutes away. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours given the Rangers' ammunition situation and the enemy's continuing numerical advantage. The real fight was just beginning. The news of incoming reinforcements crackled through Maria's radio, but 30 minutes felt like an eternity as she watched the tactical situation continue to evolve below. Through her scope, she could see that the remaining enemy fighters were regrouping and adapting their strategy. They had learned to respect her long-range capability, but they were also beginning to coordinate more effectively to neutralize her threat while maintaining pressure on the trapped Rangers. Sergeant Chen's voice came through the radio with a tactical update that confirmed Maria's worst fears. His team was down to approximately 40 rounds total, barely enough for 2 minutes of sustained combat. The two wounded Rangers were deteriorating rapidly, with Private Martinez losing consciousness intermittently, and Specialist Johnson unable to use his injured arm effectively. The defensive perimeter was contracting as the remaining Rangers consolidated their positions to better protect their wounded teammates. Maria realized that conventional sniping tactics would not be sufficient to hold off the enemy for 30 more minutes. She needed to become more aggressive and take greater risks to create enough disruption to keep the enemy from overrunning the Rangers' position. Through her scope, she began to identify high-value targets that would have maximum impact on the enemy's capability and morale. She spotted a group of 6 fighters who were preparing what appeared to be a coordinated assault from the northern approach to the Rangers' position. They had gathered behind a large rock outcropping approximately 1,150 meters from her position, and she could see them distributing ammunition and preparing grenades for their attack. If this group reached the valley floor, they would be close enough to overwhelm the Rangers through sheer volume of fire and grenades. The challenge was that all 6 fighters were using the same rock formation for cover, making it impossible to engage them individually without exposing herself to return fire from the others. Maria studied the terrain around their position and noticed that they had positioned themselves at the base of a steep slope covered with loose rocks and debris. If she could create enough disturbance in the slope above them, she might be able to eliminate the entire group simultaneously. Maria shifted her aim point to a large boulder positioned approximately 50 meters up the slope from the enemy fighters. The boulder appeared to be precariously balanced, held in place by smaller rocks that had been loosened by years of weathering. If she could destabilize the supporting rocks with a precision shot, the boulder might roll down the slope and eliminate the threat below. The shot required extraordinary precision, as the target was a small stress point on one of the supporting rocks rather than a human target. Maria calculated the trajectory carefully, accounting for the increased range and the unconventional nature of the target. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger, watching through her scope as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed. The effect was immediate and devastating. The large boulder began to shift and roll, gathering momentum as it crashed down the slope and triggering a massive rock slide that engulfed the entire area where the enemy fighters had been positioned. The 6 fighters had no opportunity to escape as tons of rock and debris buried their position completely. The sound of the rock slide echoed across the valley like thunder, and a massive cloud of dust obscured the northern approach to the Rangers' position. Through her radio, Maria could hear the amazement in Chen's voice as he reported the elimination of the assault group. But her success had also attracted even more attention to her position. Enemy fighters across the valley were now actively searching for her location, and several rocket-propelled grenades exploded in the vicinity of her overwatch point. The concussions from the explosions were becoming more severe, and Maria knew she would need to relocate again soon. But before moving, she spotted another critical target. A fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher had positioned himself approximately 1,280 meters away and was attempting to get a clear shot at the Rangers' defensive position. If he succeeded in placing a rocket among the trapped Rangers, the results would be catastrophic given their tight defensive perimeter and the presence of wounded personnel. The shot was at the extreme limit of her rifle's effective range under these conditions, and the target was partially concealed behind vegetation. Maria would need to account for significant bullet drop and wind drift, and there would be virtually no margin for error. She studied the target carefully, noting his movement pattern as he adjusted his position to line up his shot. Maria made her calculations and waited for the optimal moment when the target would be most exposed. When the fighter raised his launcher to take aim at the Rangers, Maria was ready. Her shot struck him in the upper torso just as he was preparing to fire, and both the fighter and his weapon tumbled down the rocky slope. The threat to the Rangers was eliminated just seconds before it would have been launched. But Maria's aggressive tactics had finally given away her position completely. Enemy fighters were now directing concentrated fire at her overwatch point, and the volume of incoming rounds was making it impossible to remain in her current location. Bullets were striking the rocks around her with increasing frequency, and several rocket-propelled grenades had exploded close enough to shower her with debris. Maria gathered her equipment and began moving to a new position under fire, using every piece of cover available as bullets cracked through the air around her. The movement across the rocky terrain was treacherous, especially while carrying her rifle and ammunition, but her training had prepared her for exactly these types of tactical movements under combat conditions. Her new firing position was approximately 200 meters from her original location, offering different angles of fire while providing better concealment from the enemy's current firing positions. As she settled into the new spot, Maria could see through her scope that her previous actions had significantly reduced the enemy's numbers and morale. Fewer than 20 fighters remained active, and many of them appeared hesitant to expose themselves for fear of becoming her next target. Through the radio, Chen reported that the enemy pressure had decreased significantly, but his ammunition situation remained critical. The Rangers were now down to less than 20 rounds total, barely enough for one final engagement. The wounded Rangers were in increasingly serious condition, with Private Martinez requiring immediate medical attention and Specialist Johnson becoming less effective due to blood loss. Maria realized that she needed to eliminate as many of the remaining enemy fighters as possible before they could mount another coordinated assault. She began systematically engaging targets of opportunity, prioritizing those who appeared most aggressive or who were attempting to coordinate with other fighters. Each shot had to count, as her own ammunition supply was becoming limited and there was no possibility of resupply. Her next target was a machine gunner who had repositioned to a new location and was preparing to provide covering fire for an assault team. The range was approximately 1,190 meters, and the target was well concealed behind a makeshift barrier of rocks and debris. Maria could see only portions of the fighter's body, but she identified a small area of exposure that would provide a lethal shot if she could place the bullet precisely. The shot required perfect timing, as the target was moving occasionally and the window of opportunity was very brief. Maria tracked the target's movement and predicted when he would next expose himself to adjust his weapon's position. When the moment came, her bullet found its mark, eliminating another threat to the Rangers below. But time was running out faster than Maria could eliminate targets. Through her scope, she could see that the remaining enemy fighters were beginning to coordinate for what appeared to be a final desperate assault on the Rangers' position. They had realized that their numerical advantage was declining rapidly, and they needed to act decisively before reinforcements arrived, or they lost too many more fighters to Maria's precision shooting. The enemy fighters began moving in coordinated rushes, using covering fire and tactical movement to close the distance to the Rangers' position while minimizing their exposure to Maria's long-range fire. Several groups were approaching from different directions simultaneously, making it impossible for her to engage all of them effectively from her single position. Chen's voice came through the radio with increasing urgency. The Rangers could see multiple assault groups approaching their position, and they had insufficient ammunition to repel a coordinated attack from several directions. The wounded Rangers were unable to contribute effectively to the defense, leaving only 8 fully effective fighters to hold off more than 15 attackers who were closing rapidly. Maria realized that conventional sniping would not be sufficient to stop the final assault. She needed to take the most desperate action of her career, something that went far beyond the traditional role of an Overwatch sniper. The lives of 12 Rangers depended on her ability to do something extraordinary in the next few minutes. As she watched the enemy fighters preparing for their final assault, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She was about to abandon her Overwatch position and take direct action to save her teammates, even if it meant exposing herself to almost certain death. The clock was ticking, the Rangers were nearly out of ammunition, and